Gordon, thank you so much for joining me here at the Strong and Free podcast. I'm so excited to have you on to talk about electric vehicles. But before we get into that, specifically on your research for on EVs and lower income households, tell me about yourself. How'd you get involved in this space, and what made you want to get involved in it?
Yeah, thanks, Christopher, and thanks for having me on. I guess I first got involved with EVs back in 2015. At the time, I was studying climate policy in Norway, and realized that the thing that was really happening in a big way there is electric vehicle adoption. At this point, they're on track to reach 100% adoption by 2025, and that just shows you what is possible with the right policies to spur the market. And so fast forward through doing my PhD work on EV fleet operation, I started to realize that the you know it's clear that EVs are happening, and the market is expanding, but it's going to be really important to make sure that that market has equitable access, because as with all new technologies, the benefits tend to accrue first to people with wealth and power who can acquire the technologies. And especially when you look at the history of transportation, what you see is, for example, with the automobile, when it first came out, very few people owned automobiles, but it was sort of the elite that were able to steer the public policy towards their benefit. And so if we want to find a different path with electric vehicles, I think it's going to be really important to make sure that the model availability is widespread, and also the charging infrastructure is accessible to everyone. But in the context of this paper, the particular question we want to ask is there's a lot of talk now about how the models coming out are relatively expensive and targeted towards the higher end market, and so just following current market trends, we were wondering when will electric vehicles reach cost parity across all income groups. And so there's sort of an interesting trade-off here where, because the technology is advancing so quickly, if you buy an EV today, in a few years, that might become somewhat outdated. But that also means that as the price falls, as new models come on with lower prices, that can drive higher depreciation, leading to better deals in the used market. And so that sort of, there's a hopeful message where EVs might become more accessible to lower income groups sooner than you might have expected. And so it means that EVs have the sort of this co-benefit of potentially increasing equity in transportation, but also that it's important to get the policies right, starting today, that we can't just wait until the technology matures and then start making it more equitable or expanding access. But I think that point is going to happen sooner than we think, and the limiting factor is really going to be supply of EVs in the used market.
It's fascinating. I was reading your work, and one thing that I found, which was really fascinating, was that despite the and I'll link the research below, but despite the income level, households spend roughly the similar percentages on private vehicle transportation. So low-income households is about a third, so about 33% of their take-home pay is spent on private vehicle transportation. That doesn't really change as you go up the chain in income level, maybe 38%. And I found that fascinating, so that the amount of money low-income households versus higher income households spend on private vehicle transportation is roughly the same, but the benefits of electric vehicles are almost only for upper income households, those that can afford $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 plus on a vehicle. What you mentioned before, that you saw what you saw in Norway as a more equitable public policy when it came to electric vehicle adoption. Can you talk a little bit about what makes the policy equitable in Norway, and what some lessons we can learn here in North America from that.
Yeah, well, I think the thing that's interesting about Norway is that they've never really had a strong gasoline vehicle manufacturing industry, and so starting after World War II, cars were considered sort of luxury goods and faced heavy purchase taxes. And so when EVs came around, instead of having to subsidize them, the Norwegian government was able just to provide tax exemptions, which makes the upfront purchase price actually lower than the equivalent gasoline vehicle.
Right.
And that makes them much more accessible, across the market. The other thing happening in Norway is just a very rapid expansion of public charging infrastructure. Not just so that it's not just people who have garages who can charge, but really anyone, whether they live in the city or in the countryside.
Gordon, I had another question for you, and it was about the level, and this is kind of a bit more off of your research, but the level of investment into public transit by municipalities, states, federal governments here in Canada, the United States. How big a role does that play specifically for low-income households, where where they may be situated may not be well connected to public transit, and so a private vehicle is more of a necessity, whereas more upper income households may have that luxury of having public transit as more of an option, and a vehicle is more, again, not as necessary. Is that a fair characterization, that private vehicles are more of a necessity for lower income households?
I'm not sure I would go that far, because I think public transit often is ignored. It doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. For example, in the recent infrastructure bill in the U.S., there's a lot of focus on repairing highways and bridges, which is great. But I think often during COVID, especially, what we saw was those kind of projects moving forward at the same time as public transit agencies were getting their funding slashed. And so it's really important to maintain and expand public transit funding wherever possible. But at the same time, like you're saying, it's important to acknowledge that the majority of households, regardless of income, own at least one vehicle and depend on it for access to food, healthcare, and work. And so, given sort of the road system and the transportation system and the urban layout that we see today, you could imagine that the most equitable form of transportation would actually just be guarantee access to a private vehicle for everyone. Now that isn't maybe feasible or efficient for a number of reasons, but I think it's important not to just disregard that. I think we need to take that seriously, the fact that that private vehicles are so important in today's society for access to essential goods and services.
That's such a fascinating point there, Gordon, about guaranteeing private access to private vehicles. I mean, yes, it's probably not feasible, but I'd love for you to kind of expand upon that. I think that's really, I've never thought about that, but it seems that would be quite an interesting public policy to pursue, even though it may not be feasible.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in some cases where people receive cars sort of donated from nonprofits, or receive subsidies to purchase their first car, and there's research evidence that has a huge impact on alleviating poverty and increasing access to important services. I think one thing you could imagine, one form of it you could imagine, would just be sort of a universal transportation subsidy that everyone receives, to spend on whatever form of transportation they prefer. But I think it's uh, important to remember that without transportation, it's impossible to access food and healthcare,
Yeah.
childcare, work, and so it's not just a matter of getting from point A to point B in your leisure time. It's really can be a matter of life and death.
Yeah. I want to further explore the research that you've co-authored on electric vehicles, and specifically the benefits it can have for low income households. And the first point I want to bring up with you was, in the research you talk about depreciation. And this struck me as someone who sometimes looks at depreciation for all the nice sports cars that I eventually want in the future. That depreciation amongst electric vehicles is more pronounced. And while electric vehicles don't have as many moving parts as an internal combustion engine, the depreciation specifically between the Chevrolet Bolt EV, the Cruze, and the Impala, the Bolt EV showed a more dramatic depreciation over time. I wanted you to explain that to those that may not be aware of that, because in many cases, some folks still may not think that that's the case. So first, why does that happen? And what are some of the kind of contributing factors for that?
Yeah, so I should first sort of caveat that with just saying that the market is still in an early stage, so it's hard to say whether that trend will continue or how it will evolve. But the basic idea is that the the technology is improving rapidly, and so if you buy an EV today, in 3 years there might be a new EV coming out that actually has a lower purchase price for better technology. In which case, in the used market, just the nature of supply and demand, it's that same vehicle isn't going to be able to fetch as high of a price relative, because the used market, all prices in the used market will be relative to what's happening in the new market. Just in the same way, right now, with the chip shortage happening in the new vehicle market is causing used vehicle prices to increase. If suddenly the supply of new vehicles increases or improves, then that could cause lower prices in the used market. And so, often people think of depreciation for EVs in terms of the battery. Like people think it's because the battery is degrading or there's uncertainty around battery safety. And actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. There's some exceptions like the Nissan Leaf, but actually, by and large, the EV batteries are lasting for a very long time and performing very well. But so the reason this is happening is it's kind of a more positive message that because the technology is improving, that can result in higher depreciation, which then in turn can make the vehicles more accessible to a broader market.
Gordon, I wanted to follow up with you again on a point that you raised at the outset about Norway and investing in the charging infrastructure. And so, I wrote about this in the past. I think about Canada's charging infrastructure here, and that we're in such dire need of a robust level 3 charging where you can go from 10% to 80% within whatever 20 to 30 minutes, 40 minutes sometimes. One thing that researchers, YouTubers have shown on YouTube, especially in Canada, is that even at level 3 charging stations that exist, you get error messages, you get your credit card, you have to register a credit card, you must download the app. And while I was looking at the charging infrastructure challenges, I thought, wow, this is even more challenging for low-income households who may not have access to, a credit card, as an example. What kinds of policies can governments pursue to make the infrastructure so robust? Because it seems like in Norway, they prioritize that first, almost before EVs hit the market. It's almost like they saw the 20-year out change in vehicle production. What can we do here to facilitate that for our infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important for government to take a strong hand But I think it's important to consider the different types of charging also. So the level 3 fast charging that you mentioned is necessary and really important for long distance travel and for
Yeah.
things like ride sharing.
Mhm.
But for the average driver, who's only going maybe 40 miles in a day, and in many days less than that, it's going to be much more convenient to be able to charge the car overnight, and
Mhm.
then also that reduces the cost of the infrastructure drastically.
Yeah.
If you have lower power levels, you need less electrical equipment, um, and also then if the cost is lower, it might become easier to pay for it in other ways rather than having to sign up a credit card every time. There's many slow chargers around the world that are free to charge. So what I think needs to happen is first of all, continued subsidies for home charging, because that's always going to be into, if you think about the supply of electricity for EVs, home charging is always going to be the lion's share for many years to come.
Yeah.
But also to make that more accessible, I think it's going to be important to have some sort of policy targeting landlords and property owners to either incentivize or even require them to install some sort of charging, or at least make it accessible upon request. Because for all of the homeowners, sorry, all of the households who rent, it's very challenging to invest in charging infrastructure if you might move in a couple of years. And so I think that can make a big difference. Also, greatly expanding on-street charging so that people who park on the street overnight can charge as well.
Yeah, that's such an important point. My follow-up was going to be the challenges of that for sure for apartment buildings, and other areas where charging infrastructure is not as convenient as a single family household in the garage, right? So you're totally right. There needs to be a more innovative and practical solution for many who just don't have that luxury of a private garage, and a single family household that they live in. I wanted to chat with you about maintenance costs. And so this is something that many researchers, many car companies talk about, which is the lower maintenance costs for electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines. And the common criticism that I still hear when I talk about this is that there's still many unknowns with electric vehicle maintenance because, as you mentioned earlier, the market's so new. But based on your research, can you kind of give a high level overview of how the maintenance costs differ and what preliminary evidence shows that, in fact, EVs are in fact cheaper to maintain over the lifespan of their usefulness?
Yeah, well, I think, like you said earlier, EVs, electric vehicles, just have fewer moving parts,
Yeah.
and that means there's fewer things that can break. And so, while it still remains to be seen what will happen as batteries get older, the data coming out now, like from a huge survey from Consumer Reports,
Yeah.
shows that EVs on average cost about half as much to maintain, and that results in huge savings over the long term. I think it's also important to consider sort of the certainty that provides. With internal combustion vehicles, there's always a risk that the car will break down and lead to a huge expense to repair it. Whereas with EVs, not only is the maintenance lower, but that maintenance is more it's easier to foresee what the maintenance costs will be as the battery degrades, and then you have tires and very rarely things with the drivetrain. But I think that is a huge advantage, not just reducing the cost, but also smoothing it out over time.
Yeah. Gordon, I wanted to get back to the depreciation conversation we were having, because another thing that I was thinking about as I was reading the research you co-authored, which is is there a way for companies to slow down the depreciation cost of electric vehicles by over-the-air updates? And so what I mean by that is you're totally right. I think, you look at the earlier models of the, let's say, a Tesla Model S. The software is, in today's day and age, very antiquated, even though it's not that old of a vehicle, probably just over 10 years. But the software has just, it's leaps and bounds different. Can governments say to electric vehicle companies or car companies that, you need to make sure that over-the-air updates, software updates happen for, let's say 3 to 5 years, so that the depreciation costs don't go down as dramatically, and there isn't this big leap in functionality. It seems like, when I talk to Tesla owners, they say every time there's a software update, it feels like it's a brand new car. And I think about my phone, and I do remember the discussions about making sure that there's like phone updates every so often for at least 2 to 3 years. Can governments do the same for electric vehicles to make an older EV seem like new with over-the-air updates and mandating that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Tesla is an interesting case just because it is the leader in the market, and the depreciation has been slower for Teslas, in some cases slower than for equivalent internal combustion vehicles. But I'm not sure that there's a role for government here, because I think all the companies want to be Tesla, and I think they're all moving towards sending on-air software updates. But Tesla is just much more sophisticated on the software side than the other manufacturers, and also Tesla also is much more involved in the battery manufacturing and battery control process, and if what's improving in the technology is the batteries, then software updates can help manage the battery system more effectively, but I think there's a limit to how much you can increase the capacity, and also reduce the cost of the car.
Yeah.
But I just want to reiterate that even if there is higher depreciation, it's not necessarily a bad thing in the market overall, because it does improve the accessibility in the used market.
Yeah. That's actually the next kind of question segueing from that. Your research that you co-author talk about just a slight reduction in electric vehicle prices can have dramatic effects for more large-scale adoption. And putting aside charging infrastructure, and as we both agree, we think the charging infrastructure needs to be much more robust than it is. But there's still that psychological piece of sticker price. And that was a question I wanted to chat with you about, because we both know electric vehicles, even the newer ones that are coming on the market, they are much less expensive than the first generation electric vehicles, for sure. But even still, they're still $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 more than their internal combustion engine equivalent. But just a slight reduction in some of the production costs can have a dramatic effect in terms of bringing that price down. Can you talk about that specifically, about how just little improvements in cost production can have a more wider impact on adoption of electric vehicles?
Well, I think for low income, especially, the purchase price is going to be critical, because it's not just about the total cost of ownership; it's also about having the capital to purchase the car in the first place. And so going back to something you said earlier about sort of the percent of household earnings that different households spend on transportation. It depends on the numbers you look at, but what we found in our paper is that for households earning less than $25,000 a year, who do own at least one vehicle are spending on average half of their household income on vehicle transportation, which is huge. And so that's not even before you start talking about the challenges around financing, having the capital to purchase the vehicle. And so I think because of that, targeting purchase incentives towards low-income households is going to be increasingly important in the coming years, because those are the households that are going to stand to benefit the most from electrification through reducing their expenses on transportation, but also, maybe the most sensitive to incentives, the most likely to change their behavior based on incentives because of that financing piece, and because of the challenge with the upfront cost.
So Gordon, up here in Toronto, we used to have, I think we used to have, we definitely used to have an electric vehicle grant, or if you bought an electric vehicle, the government would give you a certain amount back. And a new government came into power here in Ontario, and the premier said something to the effect of, "I'm not giving rich Ontarians who can afford $100,000 car 10 grand back," or something like that, or "I'm not going to give people 10 grand to go buy $100,000 car," basically making the inference that these grants that we're giving to electric vehicle owners are, because of the sticker price, they're going to the upper class. They're not going to those that are deciding private vehicle 20 grand, and I only have 10 grand. I don't have enough to get to 20 grand. It's like, no, I have 90 grand and I want to buy a 100 grand car. So I guess my question for you, Gordon, is about incentives to, have you found that there is a direct correlation between government incentives and people choosing to buy electric vehicles? And if that incentive is large enough, would that help, again, lower income households make that decision? It seems like that should work, but I'm not clear if there's the political capital to do that.
Yeah, so there definitely is strong evidence showing that these incentives increase vehicle sales. But like you're saying, also it has been shown that the majority of the incentive dollars currently go to relatively affluent households, in part because of, like you're saying, the higher purchase prices, but also because a lot of the incentives have taken the form of tax credits, at least here in the US, which means that you have to owe at least that much tax in the first place to take advantage of the full incentive. And so there are some new incentives coming out that have eligibility requirements by income, including in both Washington State and California State. And I think that's definitely a great way to go, and should continue expanding in the coming years. But I think it's also worth considering shifting away from tax credits towards direct rebates at the point of purchase, because that can also incentivize dealerships to you incorporate that in their marketing, and then actually make a push for selling EVs, which I think has also not something we've talked about, but that is also a huge limitation in the electric vehicle market.
Gordon, I love that idea. In fact, let's talk about it, because it reminds me so much of, I'm sure you've either heard or read Thaler and Sunstein's book on Nudge, about how we can help people make better decisions. And one decision, which I still use to this day, I read the book in university many years ago, and I still use the examples of, organ donation. You just make everyone opt in, and unless you want to opt out, you have to fill in a form and opt out. And the similar logic can be applied here. So most people don't opt into organ donation. So why don't we just assume everyone is? And again, if you want to opt out, you can. I think the same logic can be applied in electric vehicles. Let's assume that anyone who's selling an electric vehicle, that the person will want the rebate. So let's apply it to the point of sale, and let the dealer on the back end then say, we sold 20 electric vehicles, $10,000 rebate. government, here's the VIN numbers, so you can see that we actually sold these cars, and then they get it on the back end. That makes sense practically, but I can also see that, politicians are there's still this skepticism sometimes when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. How do we get more how do we increase the political capital around electric vehicle adoption, specifically on the rebate piece? Because there still seems to be that perspective that it's only going to the rich and the elites.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to expand the market so that policymakers can see that that's not the case. Um, and so there is a bit of a chicken and egg problem there. But I think, as it's important to point out that this, with the right policies, the technology is not just for the rich. It can really benefit everyone. But you have to, currently the policies that exist in a way are favored towards making it a market for the rich. So it's not inevitable that it would be that way. Hopefully policymakers can start shifting the policies more in favor of broadening access.
Gordon, your research also mentioned the disproportionate impacts that wide-scale electric vehicle adoption would have specifically for Black and Hispanic communities. And this again was very interesting, specifically in the low-income household segment. Can you talk about how this wider scale adoption would benefit those communities specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of it is just due to income disparities. And so, as I was saying, because lower income households spend more of their income on transportation, the same dollar savings can have a bigger impact. In some cases, it's also a legacy of segregation. In this case, we're studying U.S. cities in particular, and in many cases, neighborhoods that with more people of color, more Black and Hispanic households, are also neighborhoods that have been less served by public transit, so people are forced to drive further to jobs and spend more of their income on transportation. It's also a function of the housing crisis in the U.S., where there isn't enough affordable housing close to jobs, and so people have to move farther out, and then again spend more on transportation to meet their needs. And so any way that we can to reduce transportation expenses is going to have a huge impact, especially on groups that have been historically marginalized.
That's very fascinating, Gordon. Another thing that I pulled from your research too was that savings would be more pronounced in rural areas of the United States. And maybe it's just my bias, but I when talking to friends who don't live in urban centers, there definitely is this disconnect when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. Some feel that, they need an internal combustion engine vehicle because of the distances they travel, or the fact that it's winter and the snow plows aren't out in their roads. But the idea of electric vehicle adoption is less of a consideration for my friends out in more suburban/rural areas. Whereas in the city, everyone I talk to here is like, yeah, if I could afford it, I would definitely buy an electric vehicle. In your co-authored article, it talks a lot about how the savings for rural families will be even more pronounced than if you were to live in the city because of the distances you travel. How do we bridge that gap to further expand the electric vehicle market when there's still that perception, especially in rural neighborhoods? I'm sure you might have found that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it comes back to charging infrastructure. And in this case, for rural areas, it's going to be really important to have that fast charging network in place. And it also comes back to perception and awareness, and the fact that dealerships haven't been prioritizing selling EVs. And it comes back to model availability that people in rural areas tend to want larger vehicles and pickup trucks. And so as those kinds of models start coming out, I think hopefully we'll see a shift where people in rural areas start to adopt EVs more rapidly.
That's a great segue, because my second follow-up to that was that the type of vehicle that is purchased in rural communities, again, this is not me with any scientific study behind it, but my perception is that the dependency on pickup trucks, heavier vehicles, is more pronounced in rural areas. And even with more electric pickup trucks hitting the market, there still seems to be that pronounced skepticism that electric pickup truck can, haul as much weight and also have less battery degradation, where gasoline stations are everywhere and it's such a well-known technology. So there still seems to be that divide, and it's very it's like a almost as divisive as politics. It's like you're either on one side or the other. And in your research, you talk about how electric pickup trucks will still be out of reach for low-income households for some time because the price will be much higher. How can governments kind of facilitate this shift outside incentives to, I guess, change the mindset on electric vehicle pickup trucks for rural communities?
Yeah, I think awareness is key. The fact that not just are the vehicles going to be coming out, but the maintenance costs are going to be much lower, which is especially important, significant for pickup trucks and larger vehicles. But also that the ways that the advantages that EVs have over internal combustion trucks, in terms of having the power accessible at all times. Like you see the F-150 Lightning with the power trunk, and so I think and also the acceleration will be much faster, and the vehicles should last longer. So I think as these details come out, that mindset is going to shift. But it's also important that we try not to make this a polarizing issue. Transportation shouldn't be a political issue. It should be a human right. And so I think it's important to consider careful ways of marketing that bring the message to everyone, and that also sort of living in cities, that we don't start to think of EVs as some sort of way to signal virtue around climate change. That it really needs to be a utilitarian tool that can really help everyone, not just in terms of environment, but also in the pocketbook.
That's a very good point, Gordon, about the utilitarian aspect versus the virtue signaling. I think that's a conversation that more and more people need to start having. That if you drive an electric vehicle, you're not signaling to internal combustion engines that owners that you're somehow better than them or anything like that. But it's just about the utility piece. The last question I had for you, and I thought about this last night while I was doing some research, but also to myself, which is social mobility. So low-income households. You talked a lot about vehicle ownership, and that over the length of the vehicle ownership, the cost of maintenance will be lower. In fact, there'll be no fuel costs as well. But social mobility is also a factor I was thinking about. This is totally outside your bailiwick, so forgive me if you don't have the answers. But I'm thinking about how many years do many families stay in the low income threshold, and then once they move to the kind of middle class, maybe their vehicle selection goes down. So when you're in the low income household, you may say, I want to buy a really nice car, I got a much higher paying job. You get that kind of step up. But then when you enter the middle class, maybe your vehicle choices are less and fewer in length over time. And this is just my assumption. So if people are staying in low income households for a shorter period of time, as an assumption, is a vehicle lasting 5, 7, 8 years as much a priority for their decision if they know that, hey, I only need a car for a couple of years because I'm hoping that I won't be in this position much longer. Is that a fair assumption? And does that track to characteristics in terms of the vehicles people purchase? And I use that as my own example because, you know, my parents came to Toronto when I was young, and my dad would always say, "Oh, we just got this beater to run around town with the two kids." But like, I knew that I eventually wanted something better and more safe for the family. So vehicle ownership was more transactional and more just kind of biding us over until we get to a point where we can afford something better. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, if looking at the data, lower income households definitely purchase vehicles more rarely. You know, with hold on to their vehicles for longer,
Okay.
and so electric vehicles, you know, can definitely have that benefit of lasting longer. Um, in terms of the social mobility piece, you know, I guess I'll say, like I said earlier, there is a strong link that's been shown in the research between vehicle ownership and and getting out of poverty. People who own vehicles are much more likely to be able to make that jump. Um, and also just that historically, transportation and vehicle ownership has been used almost as a tool for increasing inequality. You know, if you think about highway construction in the 1950s and the way it was used to sort of wipe out entire neighborhoods, at the same time when you know, only a minority of people owned vehicles. And the vast majority of people living in the neighborhoods where highways were being built didn't own vehicles, and so I think now there is kind of both an opportunity and a responsibility to try and repair that injustice, and help make transportation more accessible for everyone, to try and reverse that trend in social mobility. You know, using transportation as a tool for increasing social mobility, increasing equity, as opposed to you know, segregating and destroying wealth in low-income neighborhoods, and increasing inequality.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and that's a really interesting point you make about highway construction and how some of our neighborhoods were constructed to increase car dependency, automobile dependency, right? And so, no, that's truly fascinating. And you know, your initial point at the outset was, or initial comment at the outset was talking about, you know, private vehicle ownership and kind of in a way mandating that or making it as available as possible across all income levels. Again, very fascinating, because recently I read an article here in Toronto about how our province recently lifted the mask mandates in response to the COVID-19 restrictions being lifted, and there are still many people that are very concerned about taking public transit, being around people who are not masking. You know, they may have immunocompromised family members or have to go to appointments. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, if private vehicle transportation or private transportation were somehow mandated or somehow available, how much of this concern would be alleviated in this kind of endemic or post-pandemic era that we're living in. It just got me thinking about that, and maybe there might be a stronger push than ever before for more equitability when it comes to private transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely wouldn't say that we should mandate private transportation. Like I was saying earlier, public transit is still critical, as people have been saying for decades. And also, you know, it's important that we keep pushing to sort of to but it's important that we keep pushing to transform urban form, to be more friendly towards public transit, and you know, allow people to get around without a private car. But I think, yeah, it's important to just acknowledge the reality that we live in an auto-dependent society, and so it's really important to provide that access. if not through vehicle ownership, then through subsidies on things like ride sharing, as well as public transit.
Yeah. Gordon, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I'm glad that we had the chance to chat about this very important topic about electric vehicle adoption, specifically for lower income households. It's one of those things where there's a lot of talk about all the new electric vehicles that are hitting the market and how cool they are and how fast they go. And they're just like, they've got the front trunk, they've got the back trunk, and, they're very utilitarian. But there's less and less conversations happening about sticker price and the fact that it's still very expensive, even for the upper middle class, right? It's still very expensive. And in time, prices will come down. But as your research shows that the electric vehicle adoption will benefit lower income households the most due to many factors, including maintenance and fuel cost savings. And that conversation is not happening. So I'm so glad that you decided to join, and I encourage everyone to check out the research. I'll link it below. And is there any more websites or research that you would suggest people who want to learn more can navigate to?
Yeah, definitely. If you go on the ICCT website, there's all sorts of resources on policies and market development that will be critical for electric vehicles. We also have a new analysis out on the charging infrastructure needs for 2030 across the US. And there's also charging infrastructure assessments for all sorts of regions around the world, as well as Canada. Yeah, go check it out. There's a lot there. And thanks so much for having me on, Christopher. I really enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Thanks, Gordon. This is great. Hopefully it's not our last conversation, because I'm such a big fan of electric vehicles and vehicles in general. But I'm just such a nerd about all the new tech that's coming this way. But I'm very cognizant of the social impacts this will have. So happy to have you on. I'll link everything in the description of this podcast. And thanks again for coming on, Gordon. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.